Welcome to Flagship Dialogues. My name is Chris Austin. I'm a CEO partner here at Flagship as well as CEO of Tessera Therapeutics. And I'm really delighted to be here today with Amy Dockser Marcus. Amy is a Pulitzer Prize winning author, a longtime reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and I'm honored to say dear friend, who we've known each other for, gosh, I've lost track, over a decade. And we came together around the problem that we're going to discuss today. And it's particularly around this book that Amy published just a few weeks ago called We the Scientists. It chronicles the story of a unique group of scientists, doctors, patients, regulators, company drug developers who came together to develop a treatment for children with a rare disease in their lifetime. And this created for us and for me personally an opportunity to test a hypothesis that I'd had for a long time, and we'll talk about that. I've been privileged to have a substantial role over the last couple of decades in establishing what I view is a disruptive technology, a positive disruptive technology for drug development, that is the involvement of patients on the research team that is developing therapeutics for their disease from the very beginning. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and how it might apply to Flagship and our company. So Amy, welcome. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here. The first thing I'd like to do for our audience is to have you tell those who are listening here in the room and virtually a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in this problem.
Yeah, well, it's nice to be here and to talk with you. But I think, like many people, when you embark on what becomes kind of a passion project,
Yes.
there's usually something personal at the core. And for me, it was the fact that my mother was diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer, metastatic gallbladder cancer. Only around 5,000 people in the United States get it. And when we were trying to help her, when I started to do research, I realized that there were no effective therapies. Mm-hmm. She was going to be offered chemotherapy that had been offered 40 years ago, and the results were pretty dismal. And why would we expect the results to be any different if for 40 years the results have been dismal? And one of the things I struggled with as I tried to help her, and she had wonderful health care. She had great doctors, the best people who, brightest minds thinking about this problem. And yet there weren't a lot of drug companies interested in this market. Mm-hmm. There weren't a lot of researchers, focused on this. Researchers that were focused had trouble getting funding. Right. I realized it was a whole systemic issue. It wasn't just about my mom. And after she passed away, I took some time off from the journal. I had received a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they allowed me to explore what are sort of the policy, how could policy change to better advance rare disease drug development? And as part of that sort of inquiry, I started looking around for people who were engaged in developing new models. Mm-hmm. One of the people who had given me some good thoughts on, research about my mom called me one day and said, Amy, I know you're interested in looking at new models. There's a group of parents and their children have a rare genetic disease called Niemann-Pick type C. And they are collaborating or trying to set up a collaboration with a group of scientists, with folks at the NIH, and they're trying to create a way to work together in the hopes that they can accelerate the search for a drug and get it to the children, while they're in their lifetimes, as you said in the introduction. Yeah. And I met everyone, including you and the parents and the scientists, and I kept going to all the meetings.
Yes. We made you an honorary member.
Kept showing up,
yeah.
Yes, reporting and talking to people, and I did think that the model was quite unusual. And I tried to think of it both as a model for this group, but also how could it extend to the broader problem? People like my mom and people like all the other patients who are looking for cures.
Right. Well, and I want to talk about that general model, but before we do this, could you tell us a little bit about NPC itself and about cyclodextrin, which a lot of the book is about, the development of cyclodextrin for these children?
So NPC disease is a lysosomal storage disorder. That's a sort of an umbrella term. There's over 50 diseases in that group. Probably people in a general audience probably are more familiar with Tay-Sachs, which is one of them, or Gaucher, which is another one of them. I learned that Niemann-Pick is very rare. At the time when I started my reporting and I asked what's an estimate on how many people in the United States have it, I was told 200. I don't know if that's an accurate number because it's so hard to know accurate numbers for rare diseases, but whatever the number is, it's very small. The group was able to identify this compound cyclodextrin, which appeared to be effective in getting the cholesterol that was stuck in the lysosome to sort of be extracted and processed in the way it was supposed to be.
Right.
And that was having positive effects in cells and in some animal models.
Right.
And so the hope was that this drug could be tested eventually in kids.
Right, right. And those of us who are drug developers may know about cyclodextrin. Cyclodextrin has been used for decades as a solubilizing agent for other drugs. It was never thought of as what drug developers call an API, an active pharmaceutical ingredient. It was always in that list which says, oh, inactive ingredients. And that was one of the challenges in the program, certainly because people weren't used to thinking about cyclodextrin itself as a drug.
That's true, although it also was an advantage because there was a lot of safety data.
Right.
Because Johnson & Johnson had developed a drug, used cyclodextrin as this solubilizer in its medication, and then so when the FDA was trying to weigh whether to allow the drug to be used in children, one of the things I think that swayed them was that there had been this collection of safety data that this drug company had, even though nobody thought that it was going to be used as an active ingredient.
Right. Yeah, and one, again, for the cognoscenti and the drug developers in the audience, and I include Amy as a cognoscentus now, is that one of the difficulties we had was that it had been approved as a solubilizing agent for IV use, but we wanted to give it to these children directly into their nervous system. So we needed it's a different route of administration, and that caused all sorts of issues, as we remember. Well, before we get too much into this, I'm gonna have you read two excerpts, as we've talked about, and the first one lays out the nature of the problem from one of the people on the team, Mark Patterson at the Mayo. So could you read that piece?
Sure. Over the years, Mark had come to believe that scientists needed a new approach if they were going to find a cure. The traditional scientific model, the very one in which Mark had been trained, relied on scientists working at lab benches, conducting experiments under the demanding oversight of charismatic senior scientists. The main ways of communicating discoveries to the wider community were through the publication of papers, a laborious process that could take months, if not years, or the sharing of selected partial information with other scientists via presentations at annual professional conferences. The system was cumbersome and slow. It might work for basic research, generating over time more leads and additional knowledge, but, Mark acknowledged, the approach had not successfully moved the needle on keeping NPC patients alive. Doctors like Mark were no closer to having a cure, a situation that he wanted to help change. But where he got stuck was in trying to come up with an alternative model that he could trust to more rapidly develop safe and effective drugs.
Well, that lays it out. And there are so many patients, as you and I know, and their families who are in this exact situation. And one of the wonderful things about this collaboration is we were able to come up with that model that Mark had dreamt about, and he was part of the team. And so at the hazard of having you now read referencing me repeatedly.
You're interviewed in the book.
I will. Well, some of you, we'll get back to this later. Those of you who know me know I also am an opera singer, and I was wondering when I first got this book, I wondered, I wonder where my little section appears, and I looked in the table of contents, and table 5 was the opera singer, and I thought, ha.
Probably there.
Probably there, right,
Yes.
exactly. So could you start to read for us on page 70 or so?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of preface it, you were kind of channeling the pros and the cons, where
Yeah.
you were outlining, the experiment that everyone was about to embark on,
Right.
and what some objections would be,
Yeah.
and what some support arguments would be.
Right.
One afternoon in his office, Chris put forth the case against collaboration that scientists often made. Patients did not have familiarity with science or scientific terms and concepts. They didn't know the regulatory rules. They did not fully appreciate the risks involved in trying experimental compounds. Science demands a level of rigor and skepticism and a tolerance for failure that is difficult in the best of circumstances for scientists who really get devoted to what they do, Chris said. The concern was, if a patient was involved or a parent, it might not matter what the data showed. They would find it difficult to admit that the data were not promising because of wishful thinking. That was the ante putting the patients on.
Right,
You want me
right.
to read what the counter argument was?
Counter argument.
To be fair,
Here it comes.
Here
Right,
it comes.
yeah.
Chris then turned around and argued the other side, like a good scientist would do. Patients brought connections to the scientific community that were important. They knew the researchers in the field better than anyone. At critical moments, they were able to marshal support, raising funds for additional experiments, calling or meeting with their congressional representatives to draw public attention to inequities in research, appealing to the FDA to approve a drug that could help keep an experiment going or launch the next one. They knew better than anyone how much was too much for a sick child to endure in order to participate in a clinical trial. Above all, Chris said, they have a sense of urgency, a sense of focus and staying on task to get to a therapeutic outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and it certainly is true. So thank you. Thank you. It certainly is true that patients and citizens in general have become more involved in the scientific process before. But my sense of this, and when we were all engaged in this, is that for the most part, patients had been, until these kinds of projects, and this project particularly, had been included at the worst as tokens. Mm-hmm. We have our patient representative, and we pat him or her on the head and say thank you, but we're going to ignore you in the worst of circumstances. And I think we've all seen that happen. Very frustrating for the patients, of course. Or they're brought in at a stage in the process, say, because we need you to take part in a clinical trial, where patients feel like they're being used. And that creates a barrier between researchers and the patients that they're trying to benefit, which this program tried to remedy both of those things by putting the patients as equals on the research team, yeah. Which was a really disruptive concept at the time, and so could you talk about your view of how different that is and whether it turned out to be a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I do try to set this experiment against the larger landscape.
Right.
It didn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
Like
right.
any kind of scientific experiment, it builds on scientific experiments that were done previously,
Exactly.
right? And that includes, for example, HIV activists who played a really big role and ended up sort of pushing the FDA to adopt the accelerated approval mechanism, to sort of use biomarkers, to have other ways of approving drugs. Yep. It led to IRBs to appoint patient representatives. It led to the NIH and the FDA to put patient representatives on various committees. Right. But you're right, that's not the same thing as being called we the scientists.
Scientists.
Yes, I mean, and I think that is a very important distinction. Right. I think what all of these models were building towards, what this history of the movement is building towards, is a recognition that patients are experts. Right. The scientists are experts. The clinicians are experts. Right. There's drug developers, they're experts. Right. Everyone brings to the table expertise. Right. And so I think what is essential in this model is that, as the book describes, is that when you put patients on the team
Right.
from the outset and you say to them, you're an expert, you're an equal member of this team, it changes the dynamic of things. You know, the current model doesn't do that, even with greater patient participation, patient voice. You know, I think it still often is pretty late in the game.
Right, it is. Hey, can you talk about some really interesting things that I feel like I should have known as a scientist, professional scientist, I suppose one could call it, although I hope those distinctions go away, of where the word scientist came from?
Yeah, I know, it's such an interesting history of it. I mean, it goes back to in a meeting of a science association in the late 1800s in Britain, and you know, they're having a meeting and they're talking about it, and there's sort of there's like a call of, you know, philosophers aren't quite scientists, and people who are doing experiments in the wild, in the field, and going out, that's like slightly different than someone sitting in an armchair and hypothesizing and speculating. Maybe a new word is needed. And so one of the founders of this British Science Association said, what about scientist? And that word sort of took off. Over the years, it became like it became a profession, because as people started to do experiments that were more challenging, as more money was needed, as equipment was needed, as labs were needed. I mean, you needed training to get into a lab. You needed a PhD, you needed an MD, you need some sort of qualification. And there became a sort of separation between folks who enjoyed, you know, counting the stars or gathering water in their backyard or going into nature and looking at the birds. That was considered something separate from the people who were being trained, receiving money as a salary, working in a lab or a university setting. And I do say in this book that this separation, while understandable in a sense, because that's the way the history unfolded, it ended up in the end kind of putting scientists away at a distance, at arm's length from the people they were trying to help. And they didn't, I mean, what I thought was interesting, one time when I came to the NIH lab, you were introducing me to some of the people in your lab, and some of the parents were there with their kids, and some of the people in the lab said that this was their first time, after years of studying this disease, of meeting someone that had the disease. That feels wrong. That, you know, that you wouldn't actually meet someone that has a disease that you've devoted your entire professional career to trying to find solutions for. And so one of the things I talk about in the book about this history is, you know, although there were reasons it happened, a change is needed. A different approach is needed. It went too far, perhaps.
And an important point that you're making is that it's hurt both sides. It's hurt the patients and it's hurt the scientists. I remember after that meeting, one of the people that you probably remember on the team, I came in the following day, and he was, I get in early, so I often get in at 6 or 6:30. He was already there, running around like a whirling dervish, which he was already, but he said to me, now I understand why I'm working on this. I am so devoted to this, I'm never leaving the lab. And I thought, oh boy, don't tell your wife. But it was the palpable sense of mission and purpose was extraordinary. And that's what I mean by how important this change is to scientists as well as patients. You know, it's interesting to think, when you first said this to me about professional scientists, I thought of, well, what was Gregor Mendel? Gregor Mendel, who discovered, as we were all forced to learn, probably in high school biology, with the Punnett squares and the P's, was a monk. He wasn't a professional scientist. He had a day job. It was called being a monk. Or Leonardo da Vinci, who made a number of advances in science, and he, of course, was a painter and a bunch of other things. And think about Ben Franklin, who also had a day job and was also a scientist. And there was also a connection, I think, with the real world in that setting, whereas scientists frequently are like Gregor Mendel's day job now. They're monks, and we take them and we squirrel them away in these monasteries we call universities or colleges, and we don't tell anybody what's going on, because it's just and they're the high priests who are the lab heads, and it results in a kind of insularism, which I think we've all recognized, which is just not healthy. I've also was struck by this when I may have told you this, that scientists have become very particular about who is a scientist.
That's interesting.
So there was a critical moment in my career where I was beginning to head the Translational Institute at the NIH called NCATS, and the previous NIH director, Elias Zerhouni, who left NIH to go run research at Sanofi, a large pharmaceutical company, when he proposed a number of programs at the NIH that would actually translate therapies to people and basic science to people, there was a prominent editorial in a very high, very prominent medical journal that declared that Elias Zerhouni was not a scientist.
That's interesting. I mean, I make the argument in the book that the parents are scientists.
Yes, right.
I mean, I think that there's a lot of evidence that the parents are scientists. So I feel like, I mean, the book is called We the Scientists, not, you know, we some professional and some not professional scientists. It's just called We the Scientists. And I guess, sort of to build on what you said, I do describe a case in the book to consider the fact that the parents are generating not emotion, not anecdotes, but real data. And what I mean by that is the parents read all the scientific literature. They immersed themselves in these papers. They wrote to the scientists, called them up, interviewed them. They drew connections between what was going on in NPC and what was going in the Alzheimer's field. They proposed scientific experiments. They came up with hypotheses. Some of them ended up as co-authors on peer-reviewed, published papers in scientific journals.
They did.
One of them was invited, you know, to talk, you know, at the institute where the Nobel Prize is given out, you know, about the work that she and others in the community were doing together as scientists. And I mean, they gathered data about their children, which they shared and collected together. They wrote down every single medicine that the kids took and how much and when, and they gathered it, and they did videos of their children. I mean, they tried to come up with information that could contribute to everything. And it was amazing also, like, one of the parents went to an FDA-sponsored workshop about how to file an orphan drug designation. And I mean, there were people from pharmaceutical companies also learning the ropes from the FDA and meeting with the regulators. And there were, this parent that was there, she wasn't the only parent. There were other parent advocates, scientists, who went to the orphan drug designation workshop, interacted just like a scientist would, came in with, you know, documents and studies and all the evidence you need in order to get the FDA to approve an orphan drug designation. It's not being done because of sympathy. It's being done because they're presenting scientific evidence of a promising hypothesis that, you know, merits the designation.
And this is a really important point I want to emphasize and have you talk a little bit more about for our audience. That is the critical the critical role that motivation plays in patient and family, parent contributions. That is, and I want you to think about your own career or your own experience with your mother's disease, where presumably before your mother was diagnosed, you'd never heard of gallbladder cancer. Before these parents had their children diagnosed, they'd never heard of Niemann-Pick C. And the scientists, the professional scientists, if you will say, well, gosh, that means that this parent has to go get a PhD and do a postdoc, and only then will they be qualified to contribute in any meaningful way to this enterprise. But we've frequently found the opposite. Why is that? And what do the people listening need to know who are developing drugs of what the patients what drives the patients to develop so rapidly this level of professional science knowledge where they can contribute in the way that you're describing?
Well, one of the main motivations for these parents is obviously they want to save their children's lives. I mean, is there any greater motivation of anyone than trying to save your own child's life?
Right.
But I also want to point out that in rare disease communities, and I've interviewed so many people in rare disease communities, not only NPC, these families know each other. They work together every day, and they don't want to harm anyone else's child either. So the notion that they're only going to try to help their own child and therefore they're willing to do anything and sacrifice other children's lives is a false one. It is really a false one. Parents and families and patients working together can create generalizable scientific knowledge, as the professional scientists like to say.
Yes.
It is possible to do that and to still have benefit for the children alive today.
Right.
And in the book, there are many scenes where these parents wrestle with that ethical tension of how can we create science that benefits our children, because that's our moral duty as a parent, to benefit our children, but also does it in such a way, collects the information and the scientific evidence in such a way that it will allow scientists to build on that for future generations.
Right.
It will allow the FDA to look at a package of information and make an assessment.
Right.
It's not just randomness or anecdotes. It's really, I can't keep stressing that point enough because it's such an important point with drug development and research, that it's science.
Right, right. And this is something I want you to talk about with regard to FDA and where FDA was when this project was going on. I think they've evolved since then, but they were somewhere between the original model, the traditional model, have to have two adequate, well-controlled, placebo-controlled trials and in large populations with clear outcomes that have statistical significance, and saying, well, gosh, maybe we should include these compassionate use examples, which I'll ask you to talk about. And still, I think for most scientists, they think of these individual patient experiences as anecdotes. And there's a very famous saying in science that the plural of anecdote is not data. And so they're thinking, well, okay, I have a bunch of anecdotes, but that doesn't amount to data. And frankly, that's the experience that we had with FDA, as you probably remember when I and the team went there the first time. And so could you talk about what your perception is about FDA's willingness to accept these kinds of data, and what the patients have been doing and researchers have been doing to try to make it easier for FDA itself to accept these anecdotes as data?
So I don't consider them anecdotes.
Yes.
I think just what I definitely don't. I mean, I think that, in fact, the seminal paper that was published in The Lancet included data from NPC patients who were enrolled at the NIH trial, in a clinical trial, and patients who were not eligible to enroll in the trial, but received FDA approval to do an expanded access under the auspices of a doctor at Rush University. And the data from both that formal trial and from the expanded access patients was included in the paper as legitimate data, not anecdotes, published, peer-reviewed. So I think that that's part of what you're sort of driving at, which is as the community recognizes that there are ways to collect data outside a formal clinical trial that can provide evidence to make an assessment, I think that there is, you have some examples now where that is being accepted by the FDA. I'm not privy to what regulatory authorities do or what they're thinking, but just a couple weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal, I reported on the approval of a drug for Friedreich's ataxia, another rare disease. And in that approval process, the FDA allowed the companies to submit an analysis that was based in part on patient histories, that was a registry that the patient community set up, funded, got all the patients to where they needed to go, working with a team of scientists and parents and, and patients themselves and the FDA created kind of the clinical assessment standard that would be acceptable. I mean, there are innovative ways to create science from all of this that, can get an FDA approval.
Yes, yeah. And I want to explore this a little bit more in something I've thought about a lot during my career, which is this divide that we often have between patients and their physicians, especially when we talk about physicians, we're talking about researchers often in this case, and that there has grown up over the last multiple decades, unfortunately, some level of suspicion sometimes between the two. Are they really out for my best interests or not, or am I just being used in one way or another? And the way to counter that is of course a sense of ownership on the part of the patients, that this is not something being done to them, this is being done with them.
Yeah.
And but that's a major cultural change for scientists who are often unfamiliar, PhD scientists who, for no fault of their own, don't have any experience talking to patients, or doctors who are used to a strictly hierarchical relationship. I tell you the diagnosis, I tell you what to do, and either you are compliant or not. That's the word we use.
Yeah.
And what is your impression about whether is that changing, or am I just engaging in wishful thinking here?
Well, the more partnerships that are created, the more this will change.
Right.
Because the way this changes is when people sit at a table together, when they get to know each other, when they share the results of their experiment, and they debate it. And I think that that's sort of the only way forward. Particularly in rare diseases, I think that there's a lot of, often the doctors who treat rare diseases also end up doing research in rare diseases, because it's hard to have such a separation when you have a very uncommon disease. And so I think that there is a sort of greater openness towards partnering, with families, patients, and others who want to sort of do a collaborative model. Sometimes these families organize themselves to support the research, that the doctor and the researcher can't get traditional funding from NIH or other traditional funders, and so they persuade their fellow scientists that their experiment is worth investing in, and they do that. But I do think that if look, it's kind of like what I was talking about with my mother with the drug that she was offered. There's decades of evidence that the current model isn't that effective. The current drug isn't that effective. We already have evidence on that side. So how do we gather the evidence for this other hypothesis? I mean, it's worth testing. And I think that there's enough evidence out there of projects like this NPC project, like the Friedreich's ataxia project, and other examples where it's a very promising model. And I think also, if I can sort of interject, in the book, I do talk about COVID patients, particularly long COVID patients, who also try to develop an innovative model. And I think that what we're seeing is that even in diseases that aren't rare, that are very common, in fact, you are going to have a group of patients who feel that the current model is not addressing their symptoms, what they're going through, in a fast enough fashion. And so they are able to do research on themselves, and thanks to the internet, in collaboration with lots of other patients, and really gather data. One of the things I quote in the book is from your former boss, Francis Collins, when he's director at NIH. And I noted that in his blog, talking about citizen science, he called it citizen science, and COVID, he cites in his footnotes for his blog a paper that was published by a group of patients who did research on themselves and on others, and published a paper that was eventually peer-reviewed and in an academic journal, but was on a website where all the scientists were publishing their data early. he cited that paper as scientific evidence about understanding long COVID, and he cited a paper that was done by a traditional scientific team and it was already in a peer-reviewed journal and published.
Right.
So I thought, I saw that blog and I thought, this is the future.
Yeah.
This is the future. Scientific evidence from the patient community, scientific evidence from, you know, the scientists that were, you know, doing stuff in a lab, you know, experiments in a lab. And all of that is required if we're going to advance quickly towards therapies and understanding.
Right, and you used the word quickly, and I want to address that for a minute. There is a concern on many scientists and physicians' part that you know, time is of the essence here. So if I have to spend time explaining to a member of the research team who's not a professional scientist, that will slow the process down. I will not get my paper published, I will not get my drug approved, I will run out of money before I get. What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say according to the studies, the process is 17 years right now. So how much slower can it get?
Yes.
I mean, so in fact, I'd say the counter argument, I'd say, I would argue that if you take some time at the front, at the start, and you talk to patients and as scientists, as fellow scientists in the journey, if you find out what the clinical course is, what symptoms matter most to them, if you find out what level of risk they're able to do, if you find out what they want the drug to do, and what's most important to them, I would argue that that extra time that you spend doing that, getting them up and running as a full member of a team and as a recognized expert, I think that's more likely, that's my hypothesis. You guys can prove me wrong or right. That's more likely to cut down on the 17 years of doing it the old way.
Yes. Well, for the audience, Amy knows this, I think the empirical evidence is very clear that it speeds up the process. It doesn't slow it down. And it's something that I think everyone who's listening is going to think, oh my gosh, I have enough problems that I got to deal with. It's the way I think we ought to think about it is there are certain things which researchers, no matter how smart they are, can never know. And you only find it when you go into a clinical trial. But by that time, you've spent years and years and years, and maybe you developed the wrong thing, or you were measuring the wrong outcome. Well, isn't that pretty important to know up front? And wouldn't that actually speed the overall process, not slow it down? And I think that's what people listening need to know, that's what the empirical evidence shows. Now, we may be sounding too Pollyanna-ish around here. So let me ask you, what have you found are the downsides to this process? What are the risks, and how would you advise those of us listening, from your experience with the book and talking to many organizations trying to do this, what should we watch out for? How do we mitigate those risks? What are the potential downsides?
So, first of all, I don't want anyone to think that I'm arguing against IRBs or human subject research protections. Obviously, there are people that would take advantage of patients, and there's a differential sometimes when someone's very ill, you know, and comes into a doctor's office, and these are important protections. So what I'm saying, though, is as we're trying to advance drug research and drug development, patients can become members of the team recognized for expertise and perform science. And so what are some of the potential risks? Well, in any effort, even ones that are low stake, any human endeavor, humans disagree. They do not see eye to eye on many things. Okay, and so how do you resolve a dispute when it happens? If you're at the NIH, you have an institutional review board that you can go to. You have probably an ethicist that you can consult with. You have your colleagues, and I mean, there's a hierarchy, an established system. I think for these partnerships to be effective, a whole system, needs to be created. I do cite in the book some researchers who called for a new social compact
Yes.
to be created that would allow patient-led research to have some sort of ethics review,
Right.
access to tools so that they could devise experiments.
Right.
Just like often scientists will share protocols to get
Yes.
feedback, why shouldn't patient-led groups share their protocols and get professional feedback as well? I mean, they can contribute to the protocol and they can have feedback on it. I mean, I think that for this to work, it's not only the individuals working together, but eventually, there'll have to be some kind of systemic infrastructure to support that.
Right.
It's probably going to have to come more from the research community
Right.
because they have the funding, they have the tools that are already established.
Right.
But in partnership, they could either think about ways to adapt the current system or in concert together create their own mechanism of resolving disputes.
Right. Right. Right.
I mean, but I think part of the issue often is we all do this, right? We want to persuade people to see things the way we see them.
Right.
That's a normal human impulse.
Right.
But I guess what the book argues for is maybe you could see things in a different way. And maybe the patients could also.
Right.
And maybe together there could be the creation of a new model
Right.
that would be at least as effective and
Right.
maybe eventually more effective
Right.
as the current model.
Right, right. And I think it's something that might in some ways be familiar to people listening. That is, a typical drug development team has, from beginning to end, about 20 different disciplines in them. And within those disciplines, as we were talking about earlier, they often speak different languages. Biologists and chemists, for instance, are famous for using the same words in two different ways. And Amy, you probably remember, I once had a fist fight in my lab because a biologist and an informatics person were using the same word in a different way, and they got so upset with each other they started a rumble in the lab that I had to break up. Not only patients but scientists can be passionate, and so what this argues for is some sort of more robust project management too. I think that the more diversity one has in the group, the more opportunity one has for misunderstanding, and it's often not intentional. But that's something also that scientists are often not comfortable with. I've been told you can't manage science.
Well, sure you can.
Right.
You can manage anything.
Yeah, you can manage anything, and I think that's something that that we'll have to explore more too.
Can I make just one suggestion about that? I was thinking about what you were saying about the, especially because I'm a writer.
Yeah.
Shared language
Yes.
versus different language.
Sure.
I think of it as a shared narrative.
Yeah.
So we, the scientists, tells the story through the perspectives of different people who are on the team.
Right.
So you get to say your piece,
Right.
and the clinicians get to say their piece, and the parents get to say their piece, and then all of you together are talking and
Right.
saying your piece. I mean, but think about one of the traditional things that scientists do.
Yeah.
They write papers,
Right.
right? They do their experiment, they gather their data, they interpret it, they write a paper.
Right.
What if, as a thought experiment, more of these teams that have patients on them as contributors and members and full members, equal partners, what if, in addition to devising experiments together, analyzing data together, and reaching conclusions together, they write papers together? That way, they have to create a shared language.
Right.
They have to agree on what are we saying? Because one of the things I find interesting between scientists
Right.
is that, and it can be confounding for outsiders, scientists look at the same set of data
Yes.
and can draw different conclusions.
Exactly.
They don't always agree with what the data say.
Exactly.
So why is that okay when that happens with scientists,
Right.
but somehow that's strange when
Right.
it happens with patients?
Right.
Why can't we just say that we bring ourselves and our various expertise to the table,
Right.
and when presented with data
Right.
that's collected in an acceptable manner that we all agree on ahead of time is an acceptable manner,
Right.
we can reach different conclusions.
Right.
And part of the process of science
Right.
is not saying that this is the truth forever,
Right.
but we agree.
Right.
We, the scientists,
Right.
have reached this conclusion based on this data and these experiments.
Exactly.
Here's how we arrived at the conclusion, and here's how we explain it.
Right.
And you, fellow scientists out there,
Right.
may disagree with us and run other experiments.
Right.
And if you have other data, let's
Great.
duke it out.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
Let's publish
Hopefully not
papers.
literally.
Right, not like in your lab, but let's publish papers. Let's go to conferences.
No, you're absolutely right.
I don't know. I feel like this scientific experiment belongs to all of us.
Right. Well, I think this, you get at a point which is also really important, which is that there is a lot of intelligence and contributions that can be made outside of the professional guild, and that science is poorer for not having that, not having that input. Could you, as Amy, as you know, and as many of my Flagship colleagues know, I moved to be the CEO of Vesalius to work on actually common diseases, not rare. After spending almost 20 years working on rare diseases, I've taken everything that I learned in rare disease drug development and are now applying it to the much larger problem of common diseases. And you referred a bit ago about the dynamics which happen within sometimes a close-knit rare disease community, and it's one of the things that I loved about rare disease research was that sense of community among the patients and the researchers and everybody who was working together. What are your thoughts about how applicable this paradigm is to the much more prevalent common diseases?
I think it's definitely applicable. I think that it's easier to launch first in rare diseases. For some of the reasons that you said. It's a closer sort of number of people, and and you know who the experts are, and you can get everybody in the same room.
Right.
But having said that, think about common diseases also. I mean, very often, once a drug is out in the general population, adverse events happen that didn't happen inside the clinical trial, because you can't even represent everyone that has a disease inside a clinical trial. So we already understand that there's going to be sort of subgroups within common diseases, and not everybody is going to want to be a scientist, right? I'm not arguing that everyone in the world suddenly has to say, hey, I'm a scientist, I want to do this. I think everyone has the right to decide. You're very sick, you don't feel well, you have a lot on your plate, you want to go to your doctor, and you want to have your doctor give you some advice, and you want to make decisions, but you're not interested in attending meetings. There's a whole spectrum of how people want to participate, and everyone has the right to do what they want. But even in a common disease, there's going to be some people who immerse themselves in the papers, get up to speed, interview the experts, feel that they have a lot to contribute and that they want to contribute, and even bring in some of their own expertise. I mean, it's really interesting with the long COVID model, because so many of the people who were sort of leading some of this effort, they call themselves patient researchers. Many of them had a science background. PhDs.
The leader of the field, that group does.
MDs. So, I mean, people, and you don't even, I'm not saying you have to contribute science, but what I'm saying is, we all are experts in something, right? We bring a lot of ourselves to the table. And I do think that the model is important in common diseases as well, because as I understood that figure about 17 years, that wasn't only with rare diseases.
No. It's actually
it's drugs.
Longer for common than it is for rare.
And so, I think that, people would have to be thoughtful. There's no one-size-fits-all model. I guess the one-size-fits model I would want to argue for is make patients part of your team, treat patients as fellow scientists, but then within whatever your group is, there's a different level of information available on common diseases. There's different requirements by the FDA for common diseases. There's other drugs maybe on the, that are already available for common diseases, so it makes the experiment different to begin with. I mean, there's all kinds of things. But when I interview patients of any type, this sort of common theme I see is that they want to be part of the process. I mean, I mean, every model has to adapt
Right.
to the new realities
Right.
of new
Right.
technology, new people,
Right, exactly.
new thoughts.
Yeah, and that's, for those of you listening in, if you're not aware of Flagship, co-sponsored with the Biotechnology Industry Organization, just a couple of weeks ago, an excellent seminar, a 4-hour long seminar on long COVID that included researchers, patients, clinicians, et cetera. And these themes kept coming up because the co-leader was actually from one of the long COVID groups. So if you're interested in this topic, I'm sure it's on Curie or other place within the Flagship system.
The Wall Street Journal, I did an article for the Journal about democratizing science. And
Yes.
one of the things that the long COVID group has done that I talk about is they're creating scorecards, that really tries to list kind of what they see as the collaborative model and what partners need to meet to be truly collaborators.
Right,
I mean,
right.
they're working on developing tools that would envision collaboration in new ways.
Right.
And and again, many of the stories that I end up writing at the Journal and in the book as well are all about, like, there are new models out there. There are people thinking
Right.
kind of like in a detailed and novel way about how a collaboration and a partnership could look in the future.
Right, right. Well, this is why I was so excited, and we were all excited to have you here, because Flagship is an organization that prides itself on thinking forward and not being limited by the current dogma, the current way things are done. And so you can't come to Flagship without being asked a what if question.
Okay.
And everybody online knows what I'm talking about, because every Flagship project starts with a what if question that asks, well, what would the world be like if? And if that world is a world worth creating, let's not get hung up at the very beginning about whether we think it's possible. That's editing too soon. But can you envision for us that what if question? What would the world be like if your vision that you explore in the book were to come true as a general case?
So I guess my sort of vision would be, what if patients were at the center of our medical system? What if patients were at the center of our drug development system? What if patients were at the center of our scientific system?
Yes.
What if? I mean, I can give you my hypothesis on what if. I lay it out in the book.
Yeah.
I think that, I think there's two things. One, I do think that this model has shown some fruits.
Right.
I talk about that the NPC model didn't achieve all of its goals.
Right.
It had a lot of successes.
Right.
I mean, really, a lot of successes, and was ahead of its time in so
Right.
many ways. I mean, people can build on this model and get even further because, you all broke a pathway for others to follow.
Right.
But the model's coming.
Right.
Because, look around, right? There's so many people now, patients, who demand a seat at the table.
Right.
I mean, whether people want to do it or not,
Right.
they're going to have to think about it.
Yeah.
And there's so many partners who do want to think about it and who understand that drugs can be developed probably in a more accelerated fashion if patients are part of the team.
Exactly.
But I do think that the big what if is, what if we just think about how to build on this model so that, patients are devising hypotheses, helping devise hypotheses, helping gather data, helping interpret data, helping prioritize things, and helping get compounds over the finish line.
Right. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to ask you two additional questions. One is a conceptual question that I've often noodled about, and I don't know if I've ever asked you this, but it struck me that the drugs, therapies in general, are consumer goods. Just like clothing or toothpaste or anything else in the consumer good world. And yet, unlike most consumer goods, where if a clothing manufacturer, if the Gap is going to create a new style they're going to have focus groups that come in. They're going to involve customers in that process from the very beginning. If you're going to create a new flavor of toothpaste, you're not going to squirrel everybody away in a secret lab for the people who are actually going to use the toothpaste. And if you did that, probably they would come up with lawn fertilizer flavored toothpaste that a lot of people wouldn't want, right? But why do we have a system where uniquely, as far as I can tell, this consumer good is developed, secreted away from the people that the consumer good is supposed to benefit?
Well, I mean, people buy a lot of jeans that they don't need, but you don't want to buy a lot of drugs that you don't need.
Yeah.
It's not, no one wants to take medicine
Yeah.
unless they, they have a terrible disease, right? So, but I mean, I don't know if I have an answer to that question, actually.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important question, and it's another way of asking kind of the question that I've been asking all along,
Right.
which is, like, is there a way to bring patients into the process?
Right.
But what you're talking about would be even further downstream, because I'm talking about, I want them to design the genes.
Yeah, right.
Yes,
Yes,
I don't want to.
that's what I'm getting at.
Right.
How
I
do
don't.
we-
I
how
don't
do
want
we
them
get
to
there?
just sit there and give their, whatever. So
Yeah.
how do you get there? Well, you have to have partners who are willing to do these experiments.
Yeah.
And again, it's most likely going to start with the rare diseases, but we're seeing some of this in the long COVID
Yes,
sector, and that's not a rare disease.
Right, right.
So, I see some movement.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Well, and for those of you listening online, I will engage in some shameless self-promotion here. Not only for Amy's book that I highly recommend that you read. For me, it's like a trip down memory lane, and it really sets out a very, very exciting vision that I think all of us at Flagship will want to buy into. But the other is that I want to ask you a question, which is an analogy which you and I have talked about, which is that, well, actually, let me mention one other thing before I get to that. There is a paper which you've referred to, which I want to let people know about. The NPC group that Amy's talking about, myself included, published a scientific paper on how this model worked.
Yeah.
And our recommendations. We have a list of things that you should do. If you're going to try this at home in your disease, this is what you should do. Yeah. And so if you search on my name and a few others, you'll find it. If you're looking for it and you can't find it, email me and I'll send it to you, because we really did want this model to be a generalizable one that others could adopt,
yeah.
Just like you're doing. So you know that I'm an opera aficionado as well as a sometime opera singer, and you asked this really interesting question of why can't science be more like opera? Now, I think everything should be like opera.
Of course.
But if we think about why opera or any musical endeavor that is not a solo act works, there is a deep interconnection and interdependency of the singers with each other, with the orchestra, with the conductor. Everyone has a basically common language, that they all read music, but they come from very different points of view, and they have very different training. The violinist and the diva soprano are going to be interested in very different things. So why is science, do you think, all about, or too many times, about solos and not about ensemble?
I think that's changing, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, look, the system was developed at a time when, like I described, with the charismatic
Yes.
scientists and people at the bench. And I think in some ways that model was sort of popularized.
Yes.
We think about, Edison or someone with the
Alexander Fleming.
Yes,
right,
the
exactly.
invention, but I think we've all recognized
Yes.
that we live in an interconnected world.
Yes.
And even to go back to your opera model, think about the people in the audience who are listening to the opera. Many of them probably have no specialized training and can't sing a note.
Yes.
Probably can't read a note.
Yep.
And if you stopped them after your performance and said, why did this move you? What did this mean to you when you're taking this all in? I bet, though, they could articulate for you and come up with a whole explanation that would move you and maybe would even make you think about the way you sing in a different way, the way you look at the music in a different way, the way you see the story in a different way. And so I love that analogy because I think that fits with science. Let's all, enjoy the opera. And let's all look at the music, the way we look at the music, and come up with something that sounds great.
Well, I cannot think of a more appropriate place to stop. Amy Dockser Marcus, I want to thank you so much for being here with us. You've given us a vision of the future that Flagship will resonate with, and I think I hope we adopt more here at Flagship and in our companies, because I think it really fits into what we're trying to do here. That is to imagine a future in which human health and human flourishing is advanced in a major way, and that's what your book is all about. So, thank you.
Thank you.